What's going on, guys? Ultra back here with another video, and today I'm going to settle a debate between two NFL all-time greats, two legends, two of the greatest players to ever play in the NFL, Peyton Manning, Joe Montana. Who is the second greatest quarterback of all time? Obviously, Tom Brady is the greatest quarterback of all time. But for most people, it's either Montana or Manning for who the second greatest quarterback of all time is. And in today's video, I'm going to be settling that debate through a criteria. Before I get into that and before I get into the debate, make sure to like this video, share it with everybody you know, and subscribe to this channel for more content. When it comes to this debate on who I'm going to rank higher all time, there has to be a criteria. There has to be things that I value that would determine who the greater player is. And so I've come up with 5 categories that I think pretty fairly show who the better or who the greater quarterback of Montana and Manning are. And so the 5 categories are the regular season as a full category. I'm taking into account winning in the regular season and statistics in the regular season, both overall throughout their career and in regards to their era and how many times they say led the league in a statistic. Doing the same thing with the postseason. How many playoff games did they win? How many, Super Bowls did they make? How many Super Bowls did they win? And then their statistics. How did they perform in those Super Bowl runs? How did they perform in the playoffs statistically? Regular season is a category, postseason is a category, as they both matter. The accolades. What did this player achieve throughout their career? And just who's the more overall accomplished quarterback? The overall support. Who had more help? Who had more support throughout their careers? Who had the better run game? Who had the better receiving weapons? Who had the better offensive lines? Who had the better defenses? And who had the better coaching? Because obviously, while the quarterback is the position that dictates winning more than any other position, you need support to win games. Every player in the NFL needs support to win games. And overall support is certainly matters. And the more a player has, the more you expect them to win. So overall support is certainly a category. And then intangibles. Intangibles are not really something that you can measure statistically. Just what was the leadership of the player like? How good was the player in big situations? What were kind of like the era specific advantages and disadvantages for each player? Because they did play in different eras. Montana played in the 1980s, and Manning played in the 2000s and early 2010s. Obviously, those are 2 different eras. So that is my criteria. That is the only real thing you can accuse me of being biased in this with is the criteria. You can make your own criteria, that's fine. But just based on this criteria, which I think is fair because it factors in everything, whoever wins this criteria is the player that I believe is greater all time. So beginning with the first category, which is the regular season, and starting with regular season winning, we look at Peyton Manning. He was 186 and 79 as a starter, which is about a 70% win percentage. He won 186 games, which is tied for second with Brett Favre all time. He won 12 division titles. He had 8 first-round byes. He had 11 12-win seasons, and he had 15 winning seasons. Peyton Manning, his teams always in the regular season performed well. You look at 11 12-win seasons and 8 first-round byes. That's very impressive. You look at just how the consistency that they played with. The Colts for the 2000s led the decade in win percentage. You look at Denver in the 4 years he spent with them. They led the NFL in win percentage. So Peyton Manning, when it came to regular season winning, was as great as anybody all time outside of maybe Tom Brady. Joe Montana is also right in that category. 117 and 47 as a starter, so 71% win percentage, slightly higher than Peyton Manning. 117 wins all time, which is tied for 13th. Got to factor in that Joe Montana played 12 years compared to Manning's 17. So the win total is going to be a little bit lower. The percentages are basically even. Montana just 1% higher. 9 division titles, 8 first-round buys, 3 12-win seasons. The reason why it's lower for Montana than it is for the Niners in general during his time is because Montana, he missed games. He did not play full seasons, which is something that does, I think, hurt him in this debate. Peyton Manning almost always played the full season, whereas Montana didn't. And so he only won 12 games as a starter 3 times. He did have 10 winning seasons, which is very impressive. Both of these guys won a lot of games in the regular season and won at a very high clip. When you look at it, Manning's percentage is slightly lower, but he won much more games because he played longer. So when you look at the percentages, it's basically even, but Manning gets the longevity. Manning dominated his division at a higher rate than Montana did. When you look at 12, actually, it was pretty close. Manning won 12 division titles in 17 years. Montana won 9 in 12 years. So Montana's percentage is actually a little bit higher than Manning's, but Manning won more division titles. Montana had significantly fewer 12-win seasons when you compare 3 and 11. Manning won 12 games 11 times. Montana won 12 games 3 times. And you do have to factor in there was a strike-shortened year during Montana's career, but still, that gap is significant. The winning seasons, Manning had 15 winning seasons as a starter. His only years that he didn't have a winning season was his rookie year in 1998 and his 2001 campaign. Montana had 10 winning seasons, did not have a winning season twice in his career. So overall, when I look at regular season winning, it's pretty close. You could go either way here. I do think Peyton Manning wins the regular season winning category because you look at the percentages, they're basically even, but you look at the gap in 12-win seasons, the gap in winning seasons, the gap in wins all time, the longevity of Peyton gives him the edge in this category. So Peyton Manning gets the edge here. You then look at the regular season statistics, and this is where Peyton Manning begins to create a little bit of a gap between him and Joe Montana. You look at Peyton Manning in the regular season, 71,940 yards, which is third all time. He led the league in passing yards just 3 times, which was actually a little bit surprising to me. Thought he would have done it more, but did lead the league in passing 3 times. Keep in mind, he did retire all time with the yards and touchdowns record. So that is very impressive. That has since been overtaken by Breeze and Brady. But he did retire with those records. In touchdowns, 539 all time, which is third all time, 4-time touchdown leader. In passer rating, 96.5, which is 11th all time. He led the league in rating 3 times. Those are the major quarterback statistics. I wanted to throw in a couple other ones just so, we could get a little bit more statistics to kind of give us a bigger picture. In yards per attempt, Peyton Manning, 7.7, which is tied for 15th all time. He led the league in yards per attempt once. In completion percentage, 65.3%, which is tied for 11th all time. He led the league in completion percentage twice. He is the all-time leader in fourth quarter comebacks and game-winning drives with 43 and 54 respectively, which I think that's pretty impressive because Peyton Manning, as we went over, he won 70% of the games in his regular season career. So he was, at least on the surface, not trailing a ton, and he's still up there all time or not just up there, he's the leader all time in comebacks and game-winning drives. So that is very impressive for Peyton Manning. You also look at the fact that he led the league in fourth quarter comebacks 3 times, game-winning drives 4 times. Peyton Manning, great regular season statistics. You look at Joe Montana, he passed for 40,000 yards and 40,551 yards, which is 21st all time. Never did lead the league in passing yards. 273 touchdowns, 19th all time, two-time touchdown leader. 92.3 passer rating, 18th all time, two-time passer rating leader. 7.5 yards per attempt, which is tied for 29th all time. He led the league in yards per attempt once. Completion percentage, 63.2%, which is 24th all time. He led the league in completion percentage 5 times, which is very impressive for Joe Montana. His efficiency was honestly right on par with Peyton Manning, maybe even a little bit above it. When you look at completion percentage, yards per attempt, and rating, he's 15th all time in fourth quarter comebacks with 26 and tied for 23rd all time in game-winning drives with 28. He wasn't trailing a ton because he won 71% of his games, but Peyton did, have to come back a little bit more, at least according to the game-winning drives and fourth quarter comeback statistics, which is, I think, a bit of a plus because it showed Peyton, when he had to come back, at least in the regular season, was able to. Montana had a little bit more support, at least during these games. And he led the league in comebacks and game-winning drives once. So when we look at this, we do have to add into the context that Montana in his era, the passing statistics were not what they were in the 2000s and early 2010s when Peyton played. So Montana's statistics, obviously, they're probably not going to be as good as Manning's were, especially when you take into account the fact that Montana only played 12 seasons and he missed games in most of those seasons, whereas Manning played 17 and he played every game almost every season. So Manning played longer and he played in a more pass-happy era. But despite that, you look at the fact that Montana wasn't relied upon the way Manning was. You look at the difference in volume stats, the yards, the touchdowns. Manning much more impressive in those categories than Montana was. The efficiency categories slightly lean towards Montana, but Manning has impressive numbers there as well. And then you also look at the fact that in comebacks and game-winning drive situations, Manning is the all-time leader, and he led the league in comebacks and game-winning drives more than Montana did. You then look at the offenses, and you look at the offenses that they led and how they ranked. Peyton Manning and Joe Montana, their offenses in yards per play. And so the two statistics that I used were yards per play and points per game. I didn't use total yards because I felt that they could be not fully telling of the full story. I felt on a per play basis, it's more telling of how good an offense actually is rather than just the overall total raw numbers. And I showed where they ranked, where their offensive is ranked each season in yards per play and points per game. So Peyton Manning, his average offense in yards per play ranked at a 5.5, which is basically 5.5, compared to Montana, which was at 5. So very close there. Slight edge to Montana, but very close. You look at, where they ranked. Peyton Manning had the number one offense in yards per play twice, had a top 5 offense in yards per play 11 times, had a top 10 offense in yards per play 14 times. Compare that to Joe Montana. He had a top 1 offense. He had the number 1 offense in yards per play twice. He had a top 5 offense in yards per play 9 times, and he had a top 10 offense in yards per play 11 times. Just to note here, Peyton Manning had a top 10 offense of all time in yards per play with the 2004 Indianapolis Colts. So when you're looking at the yards per play offenses, pretty much a tie. Montana's was slightly better for the era, but Manning, his top offenses were a little bit better, and he did lead a top 10 offense all time in yards per play, which is something Montana cannot say. When we look at the points per game offenses, how they did in scoring offenses, again, very, very close. Manning, his average points per game offense ranked as 6.2 compared to Montana's 5.9. Again, a very small advantage for Joe Montana. You look at Peyton's offenses, they were the number one scoring offense twice. They were top 5 in scoring offense 12 times and top 10 13 times. Meanwhile, Montana had the number one ranked scoring offense twice, was top 5 times, and top 10 11 times. So they had the same number of number one offenses, but Manning had significantly more top 5 offenses in scoring, 12-5. Top 10 offenses, it's obviously much closer. Manning had 13 compared to Montana's 11. Montana, what gives him the slight edge in averages is Manning did lead 3 below average offenses in points per game, ranking 17th, 19th, and 19th, compared to Montana, who Montana never had an offense in points per game that was below league average. Though keep in mind, Peyton Manning led a top 10 offense of all time in points per game in 2013 with Denver. So when you're balancing all that out and you're comparing the offenses that these teams led, or that these players led, I should say, both of them were very impressive. I think Peyton Manning had a few more elite offenses than Montana did. Montana's were a little bit more consistent, but it is basically a tie here in offensive comparisons between the two offenses that these teams led. But when you look at the regular season statistics, Peyton Manning's statistics, even when adjusting for era, are more impressive than Joe Montana's regular season statistics were. So Peyton Manning gets the edge in this category as well. Moving on to the playoffs, and this is when we see it shift in the favor of Joe Montana, and pretty significantly, to be honest with you. Peyton Manning in the playoffs was 14-13. He won 52% of his games. He had 14 playoff wins, which is tied for third all time. He won 2 Super Bowls. He made it to 4 Super Bowls. He made it to 5 AFC championship games. And he went one and done, meaning he lost the first playoff game 9 times. Not terrible on the surface, especially when you're comparing it to normal quarterbacks. It's actually pretty impressive considering it's a winning record. Top 3 all time in wins, 2 Super Bowls, 4 Super Bowl appearances, plenty of conference title appearances, but the 9 one and dones are very telling. And especially for a player that was as good as Peyton Manning was in the regular season, not very impressive in the playoffs when it came to winning. Compare that to Joe Montana, 16-7 in the playoffs with a 69 win percentage. 16 playoff wins is second all time. 4 Super Bowls, 4 Super Bowl appearances, 7 conference championship appearances, and 4 one and dones. So Montana in playing less games in the playoffs, won more games than Peyton did, significantly higher win percentage, made it to just as many Super Bowls in fewer amount of seasons, won all of his Super Bowls compared to Peyton only winning 2 of them, made it to more conference title games, and had fewer one and dones, 4-9. Montana certainly gets the big edge in playoff wins. Moving on to the competition that they played, just to give you a bit more of perspective on, if Montana was facing weaker teams, if Manning was losing to better teams, all of that to give you more perspective into the winning. Peyton Manning played 12 plus win teams in the playoffs in his career. In those games, he was 7-5 with 14 total touchdowns to 13 interceptions. Joe Montana in his career played 8 12 plus win teams in the playoffs. He was 5-3 with 26 total touchdowns and 9 interceptions. So you look at it, Manning did play more 12 plus win teams in the playoffs than Montana did. The records 7-5 and 5-3. Manning won about 58% of the games compared to Montana winning about 62%, which is slight edge to Montana. But when you look at the touchdown to interception ratio, it's a no contest. Manning had 1 more total touchdown in those games than he did interceptions, 14-13. Basically a completely mediocre touchdown interception ratio compared to Joe Montana, who was 26 touchdowns to 9 interceptions. So he threw fewer interceptions than Peyton did in less games, while almost doubling him up in touchdowns. So in the playoff competition, while yes, Manning played better teams, he performed worse against the better teams that he played in the playoffs than Montana did, and it was by a significant margin. We move on to the postseason statistics. Peyton Manning in the playoffs, 7,339 yards, 272 yards per game, which is second all time behind Tom Brady. 40 postseason touchdowns, 1.5 per game, which is fifth all time. 25 interceptions, which is 0.9 interceptions per game. 87.4 passer rating, which is tied for 21st all time. 7.1 yards per attempt, which is tied for 34th all time. 63.2 completion percentage, which is tied for 13th all time. And he is tied for 11th all time in fourth quarter comebacks with 2 and 13th in game winning drives with 2. Not bad numbers, considering the fact that mostly all players statistically go down from regular season to postseason due to the fact that they're playing better teams and oftentimes better defenses and sometimes on the road more. But still not nearly as impressive in the regular or in the postseason as he was in the regular season statistically. And Montana actually is a rare case of a player that actually got a little bit better in the postseason compared to the regular season. 5,772 yards, 251 per game, which is sixth all time. 45 touchdowns, 1.9 per game, tied for second all time. 21 interceptions, which is about 0.9 per game. So the interceptions, Manning and Montana, basically about even there, but Montana threw for significantly higher touchdowns per game, but Manning did have more yards per game. In passer rating, 95.6 is 11th all time in the playoffs. Yards per attempt, 7.9 is 14th all time in the playoffs. 62.7 completion percentage is 16th all time in the playoffs. And in fourth quarter comebacks and game winning drives, he is second in comebacks with 5 and third in game winning drives with 5. So Montana had a better touchdown to interception ratio in the playoffs than Peyton did, threw for less yards, but had a higher passer rating, higher yards per attempt, slightly lower completion percentage, and more comebacks and more game-winning drives. Statistically, in the playoffs, maybe a little closer than some would think, but certainly Montana does get the edge. We then move to the Super Bowl stats. How did these players perform in the big game in the Super Bowl? Each of them made it to the Super Bowl 4 times. Peyton Manning was 2-2 in the Super Bowl. He averaged 250 yards per game. He had 3 touchdowns to 5 interceptions, had a 77.4 passer rating, 6.4 yards per attempt, and completed 66.4% of his passes. Compare that to Joe Montana, 4-0 in Super Bowls, 285.5 yards per game, 13 total touchdowns to 0 interceptions, 127.8 passer rating, 9.3 yards per attempt, and 68 completion percentage. When you factor in the era that Montana played in compared to Manning and how just quarterback stats were down in the 80s compared to what they were in the 2000s and early 2010s, there's no contest here. There is really no contest here when it comes to Super Bowls. Montana was great in all 4 of his Super Bowls. Montana, there's nothing you can really nitpick to Montana. I mean, yes, you can say he was on the better team, which is true, but he performed at an elite level on those teams in every single game. He is the greatest Super Bowl quarterback of all time, and it's really not that close, in my opinion. I don't think you can really argue. I know Tom Brady has all the Super Bowl records, and he probably has a couple more iconic moments by getting there so much more. But when it comes to pure statistics in the Super Bowl, Montana is better than Brady and much better than Manning. Manning is 2-2 in the Super Bowl. When you dissect his Super Bowl performances, in 2006 against the Bears, he was solid. He wasn't bad. He was good, but it wasn't a Peyton Manning game where you went, wow, Peyton Manning's awesome. It was just like, yeah, okay, he was pretty good. He won Super Bowl MVP mostly because nobody really stood out in that game, and because Peyton didn't really have a bad game. He just had a pretty average game for Peyton standards, and mostly because I would honestly say because of his AFC Championship performance the week before against New England. He won Super Bowl MVP. You look at 2009, I do think Peyton is ragged on a little bit too much for the 2009 Super Bowl. He did throw a terrible pick six to Tracy Porter that ended the game. But outside of that, he was very good. He was, he had a couple drops in that game. There was a drop touchdown by, I believe it was Pierre Garçon that would have made that game closer. He had a good performance, I would argue, in that game outside of that one throw. But he did have that one throw, which is a huge back-breaking mistake. You look at the 2013 Super Bowl against Seattle. Yes, his team was awful, and you can't fully blame him for the loss, but he was awful too. And against Carolina in Super Bowl 50, he was not good. He was pretty bad. He kind of got carried by he really got carried by his defense in that game. So Peyton Manning had two solid Super Bowl performances and two bad Super Bowl performances compared to Montana having four excellent Super Bowl performances. It's not even competitive based on who was better in the Super Bowl. When you look back to the Super Bowl winning playoff stats, Peyton Manning in his two Super Bowls, in his two Super Bowl runs in 2006 and 2015, was 225 yards per game, 6 touchdowns to 8 interceptions, and a 72.4 passer rating. Not good. You look at the 2006 playoffs for Peyton Manning. He was not good against Kansas City. He was bad. He was really bad against Baltimore. He was bad in the first half against the Patriots in the AFC Championship game before having an excellent second half. And you can't take that away from him. He was awesome in that second half. He outplayed Tom Brady, and he rose to the occasion in what was the biggest game of his career. And in the Super Bowl, he was good. He wasn't great. He was, he's played better games for sure, but he was solid. And then you look at the 2015 run, didn't really do anything against Pittsburgh, had a solid game against New England in the AFC Championship, but was just mostly as a game manager in that game. And against Carolina, he was pretty bad. His defense carried him in that run. The defense did the heavy lifting for Manning in those two Super Bowl runs. The only games Manning really held up his end of the bargain was the 06 AFC Championship and 06 Super Bowl. Outside of that, Peyton's defenses really did the heavy lifting for him in the other games. Compare that to Montana, 270 yards per game, 34 touchdowns and 10 interceptions, 111 passer rating. Not even close. Montana was awesome in all his Super Bowl runs. Much higher yards per game, much better touchdown interception ratio, much higher passer rating, and what was a worse statistical era. So there's no comparison here when it comes to the playoff statistics. That clearly goes to Joe Montana when you're factoring in, just raw statistics and how they performed in the Super Bowl and in their Super Bowl winning post. Moving on to the accolades here. This is where Peyton Manning begins to make a bit of a comeback here. When you look at the accolades for Peyton Manning, he was a 2-time Super Bowl champion. He was a Super Bowl MVP in 2006. He was a 14-time Pro Bowler. He was a 7-time first-team All-Pro and 3-time second-team All-Pro. He was a 5-time MVP, 2-time Offensive Player of the Year, and a Comeback Player of the Year, as well as making the 2000s All-Decade Team. Obviously, a very impressive resume for Peyton Manning. The MVPs, he has won the most of any quarterback and any player in NFL history. There is some controversy about that in both positive and negative ways. So I'll go through that and I'll address that. But Peyton Manning does have the most first-team All-Pros of any quarterback in NFL history. He does have the most MVPs of any quarterback in NFL history. He does have the most Pro Bowls outside of Tom Brady of any quarterback in NFL history. When you compare that to Joe Montana's awards and accolades here, again, Montana has a very good resume. Both of these guys' accolades could fill a long hallway, right? They're both excellent accolades. Montana was a 4-time Super Bowl champion, 3-time Super Bowl MVP, 8-time Pro Bowler, a 3-time first-team All-Pro, 2-time second-team All-Pro, 2-time MVP, which I will again get to. Should he have won more? Did he rob a couple? He was an Offensive Player of the Year one time, a Comeback Player of the Year one time, and was on the 1980s All-Decade team. When it comes to the raw awards and accolades and achievements, as well as factoring in the statistics that these players led the league in, of course, we saw Peyton Manning did that more than Joe Montana did, which is not even adjusting for era. That's just where were you statistically regarding your era, and what were your awards regarding your era. Peyton Manning does have more accolades and more awards and more things on his resume than Joe Montana does. It's fairly close, but it does go to Manning. Now to the MVP argument. I've seen a lot of people over the years question the validity of Montana and Manning's MVP awards. People think Montana should have won more, and they think Manning robbed a couple because his last name is Manning. So when it comes to the MVP arguments that these guys had, I believe that Joe Montana had MVP seasons in 1989 and 1990. So 2 MVP seasons. He was worthy of both of those awards. You could have made a somewhat decent case for Randall Cunningham in 1990, but in 1989, Joe Montana was certainly worthy of MVP. He had one of the best quarterback seasons ever. Peyton Manning, same thing. In 2004 and 2013, he had two of the greatest quarterback seasons I think we will ever see from a quarterback. I would argue they're both top 5 all time, and I would argue his 2013 MVP season may just be number 1. It's certainly in the conversation. Manning had the better top-end MVP awards when you look at his best seasons in 13 and 04 compared to Montana in 89 and 90. Now, to the MVP arguments. Did these guys deserve more or fewer than they ended up getting? Starting off in 1987, John Elway won the league MVP over Joe Montana. And I don't have a huge problem with this, because Elway was great in 1987. But when I look at who won the award, did Elway really deserve the award more than Montana did? When we compare, okay, Elway passed for just 200 more yards. Not even 200 more yards. Elway passed for 144 more yards than Joe Montana did in 1987. When it came to touchdown interception ratio, Elway had 23 total touchdowns to 12 interceptions. Montana 32 total touchdowns to 13 interceptions. Montana had significantly higher passer rating than John Elway did. Montana's passer rating in 1987 was 102. Compare that to John Elway, he had a passer rating of 83. So, yes, Montana had a much, much better team in 1987 than John Elway did. Don't get me wrong. Elway did have, I believe, underrated defensive support. Just people make it out as if Elway just had zero talent whatsoever. I do think they underrate some of the offensive line and defensive help that he did actually receive. His defense that year was 7th in points allowed, which was actually pretty solid, not too far off from what the Niners were. And in terms of yards allowed, they were 9th overall in the league. And they were overall just a pretty good defense. They had a Pro Bowl offensive lineman. The Broncos that season, 1987, I do think, they weren't a terrible team. They were not a great team. They weren't as good as San Francisco was, but I just can't get over the extreme, gap in efficiency between Montana and Elway in 1987 to give Elway this award. I believe it should have gone to either Joe Montana or Jerry Rice in this season. Rice had 22 touchdowns. So if we wanted to give it to Jerry Rice, I would be completely fine with that. Personally, though, I'm always going to lean quarterback over running back when it comes, or over receiver, excuse me, when it comes to winning MVP, because the quarterback is the one throwing the receiver the ball. And if the receiver's putting up great statistics, it usually means the quarterback's putting up great statistics. And quarterbacks are just more valuable than receivers are. So I would have given the MVP in 1987 to Joe Montana. In 2000, for Peyton Manning, Marshall Faulk won MVP. When we look at this, Peyton Manning led the league in passing yards, touchdowns, and completions in 2000. Marshall Faulk won MVP despite missing 2 games. He did not lead the league in rushing, and 17 of Faulk's 26 touchdowns were actually within 10 yards that season. You also look at that season as, yes, Faulk was the key cog in the Rams offense, but the Rams offense was still coming off a season in which they had one of the best seasons ever. You look at Kurt Warner, he still led the league that season in completion percentage and yards per game, and he made the Pro Bowl. The Rams had a very, very talented offense around Marshall Faulk, and they won 10 games. It wasn't like the Rams had a significantly better record than the Colts did in 2000. Quite the opposite. The Colts and Rams each went 10-6 that season. You look at the Rams, they had a Pro Bowl left tackle in Orlando Pace, who's one of the best tackles of all time, one of the best linemen of all time. They had 2 Pro Bowl receivers and a Pro Bowl quarterback in 2000. Falk had a ton of help in terms of supporting cast offensively in 2000. So while Falk was awesome, there's no doubt about it, he did have a ton of help, and it wasn't as if Falk had an amazing, amazing statistical year. He did not lead the league in rushing. He did not lead the league in rushing, and 17 of his 26 touchdowns were within 10 yards, which short yardage touchdowns, yes, they count, and yes, they absolutely do matter, but they don't quite impress me to the point that I think, okay, you deserve MVP for doing this. I just don't think that. You look at what Manning did. He did have a Pro Bowl running back and Pro Bowl receiver in Edgerrin James and Marvin Harrison, but he did not have any Pro Bowl offensive linemen, and he really carried the team. He threw for the most yards in the league. He threw for the most touchdowns in the league, and he led the league in completions. He carried Indianapolis in 2000. In 2000, Manning's defense was 23rd in yards per play. He took that team to a 10-6 record. I would argue in 2000, Peyton Manning deserved the MVP. Marshall Faulk did win it. I would have given it to Peyton Manning. In 2003, there is some controversy here on should Peyton Manning have won the award fully, or should he have won it at all? And the 2 guys that are compared here are Priest Holmes and Steve McNair, who did split the award with Peyton Manning. Peyton Manning had over 1,000 more pass yards than Steve McNair did. McNair missed 2 games in the regular season, and he was swept by Peyton in those games. He was swept by Peyton in the regular season by Peyton's Colts. You look at that. You look at the gap in pass yards. Yes, McNair was a bit more efficient, but I think Manning certainly deserved the award fully over Steve McNair just based on the difference in volume and the head-to-heads. You then look the other guy that people argue is for Priest Holmes. And Priest Holmes had a great season in 2003. Great season. I would argue that Priest Holmes, 18 of his 27 touchdowns, guys, were within 5 yards. Yes, he had an awesome season. There's no doubt about it. There's no doubt about it for Priest Holmes. He was awesome. He was great. But at the end of the day, it's Peyton Manning. Peyton Manning. And Peyton Manning in 2003 had one of his best seasons. He really did. He had one of his better seasons in 2003. And it's a quarterback is always the most valuable position in the NFL. It dictates winning the most. Obviously, supporting cast does matter. But Priest Holmes, I don't think deserved the award over Peyton Manning. You also look at that as to say the Chiefs had 2 all-pro offensive linemen in 2000. They had an all-pro tight end, and they had a Pro Bowl quarterback. Holmes, for as good as he was, he did not lead the league in rushing. He had a lot of offensive help. I would argue almost as much help as Peyton Manning did in 2003. I really would. I think you can certainly make that argument that Peyton Manning had less offensive help in 2003 than Priest Holmes did. Just looking at it, I went through Holmes's help. Compare that to Manning's. Manning had, let's see, Peyton Manning in 2003 had a Pro Bowl receiver in Marvin Harrison, and that was it. That's all the Pro Bowlers or all pros Peyton Manning had compared to Priest Holmes. And they only won one fewer game. You also look at the fact that in 2003, Peyton Manning had the 19th defense in yards per play and the 20th defense in scoring. You also look at the fact that Peyton Manning had the 26th ranked run game in yards per attempt that season. He took that team to 12 wins. Peyton Manning fully deserved the 2003 MVP. The 2005 MVP was Shaun Alexander, who had an excellent season. Again, excellent season. Shaun Alexander had 20 of his 28 touchdowns within 6 yards that season, total touchdowns. Peyton Manning won more games with a worse defense in yards per drive than Alexander did and in points per drive, and he led the league in passer rating. Peyton Manning in 2005, again, he had one of his best seasons. His run game in 2005 was 24th in yards per attempt. It was not a great run game that season. It was not. And yet the Colts, they had the number 1 seed in the AFC for a reason, because they had Peyton Manning. And at the end of the day, of course he's more valuable than Shaun Alexander is, guys. Of course he is. Peyton Manning should have won the 2005 MVP. The 2008 MVP, this is one that I think is the most debated. Should Peyton have won the 2008 MVP? Because statistically, he wasn't the best quarterback. Rivers was better. Romo, Breeze, they all had statistically better seasons than Manning did. But of quarterbacks that won 10 games that season, Peyton had the best stats. He led the NFL in fourth quarter comebacks and game-winning drives that season. He also won 12 games that season with the 32nd ranked run game in yards per attempt, the worst run game in the NFL, and the 27th ranked defense in yards per drive. 12 wins with no run game and a bad defense. Give me Peyton Manning every day for that award. And in 2009, this is a very interesting race, in my opinion, between Peyton Manning and Drew Brees. Peyton Manning went 14-2. He started 14-0. Could have gone 16-0, but of course, Jim Caldwell decided not to. He led the NFL in game-winning drives and fourth quarter comebacks, so that's impressive on his part. But you look at it, Drew Brees did go 13-2, which is pretty much the same record, only one fewer game than Peyton, compared to missing 2 fewer games than Peyton did, as Falk did in 2000 or McNair did in 2003. He threw more touchdowns despite fewer games that season. He had a higher yards per game than Peyton Manning did. He had a higher passer rating than Peyton Manning did. And defensively, the support was pretty similar in 2009. I will say Brees did have a better run game. But overall, on similarly matched teams, Brees and Manning had similarly matched records, and Brees' statistics were a little bit better than Peyton Manning's were in 2009. So I would have been fine with giving Peyton Manning the award in 2009, but personally, I would have given that MVP award to Drew Brees. So I don't think Peyton Manning deserved the 2009 MVP. So technically, of his 5 MVPs, I think 4 of them were deserved, and the 2009 one was not. But I do think he deserved to win MVP in 2000 and 2005 that he did not win. As for Montana, the only really controversy here is 87. I do think he should have won over Elway. You could make arguments all the way through with Elway, Montana, and Rice that season, though. But Peyton Manning certainly in the MVP category outdoes Montana. We now get to the team support that these guys had, and they both had a very good amount of team support. How I'm going to be doing this is I'm going to be going through the run games, the receivers and tight end help, the offensive line help, the defenses, and then the coaches. So who had better run games, better receivers and tight ends, better offensive lines, better defenses, and better coaches. Whoever has more, whoever wins those categories, whoever has less support in more of the categories does win the category, because it would have meant that they went through their career with less support, making their accomplishments a bit more impressive when it just comes to that. So when you look at the run games here, I used rush offenses in yards per attempt for both of these guys. The reason is you can be a bad run offense, but run for a lot of yards if you're running the ball a lot. And that's because just over reliance on the run game can create inefficiency, and it can lead to lack of points. And that's just overall, that doesn't mean you're a good run game. It just means you can't pass the ball. And so when you look at it in yards per attempt, how good these run games actually were, Peyton's run game averaged about 19 and a half. So they were about the 19th best run game in the NFL. Peyton was working with that just on average every year. Montana, meanwhile, in his 12 years, his run game averaged about 11 and a half. So Montana's run game was significantly better and more efficient than Manning's was. Neither of them had the best run game in the league when it came to yards per attempt ever. Manning had one top 5 run game. This was in 2001. It finished 4th, in yards per attempt, compared to Montana, who had 5. He had 85, 87, and 1988 that finished 2nd, and 1984. So 4 seasons that finished 2nd, and then also a season that finished 5th in 1983. Very good run games throughout the 80s, which was certainly helpful to Montana when it came to success. Manning only had one other top 10 run game, which was in 2000, when his run game finished 7th in yards per attempt. So you look at that, and then you look at Montana, who had the 9th ranked run game in 1989. So that's 6 top 10 run games compared to 2 for Montana. Montana clearly loses this category because his run games were significantly better than Manning's were. And people love to bring up, Marshall Faulk, Edgerrin James, C.J. Anderson was pretty decent. Joseph Adai was solid. Montana did have Roger Craig, who is one of the better running backs of all time. He is a Hall of Famer, or should be. And that's great. But in terms of just raw production and raw efficiency from their run games over their careers, Montana's run game was significantly better. So don't give me these numbers about Pro Bowls or All Pros or any of that kind of stuff. When it came to production, Montana's run offenses significantly better than Peyton's. Moving on to the receiving help, for who had the better receivers and who had the better tight ends, there's not really anything you can use for production here. This is simply because, first of all, there's different eras. Peyton played in a more pass-heavy era, and also the receiver statistics and the tight end statistics specifically correlate to the quarterbacks. Whereas for rush offenses and defenses, you can more look at how they actually performed rather than the talent to gauge how good they were. Whereas you kind of have to look at just the awards and accolades for the weapons and the offensive line, because it is a bit more quarterback driven. So Peyton Manning, he had 21 Pro Bowl seasons out of wide receivers throughout his career. He had 5 first-team All-Pro seasons from wide receivers throughout his career. Marvin Harrison made 8 Pro Bowls and 3 first-team All-Pro teams with Peyton Manning. Reggie Wayne, 5 Pro Bowls and a first-team All-Pro with Peyton Manning in 2010. Demaryius Thomas made 3 Pro Bowls with Peyton Manning. Dallas Clark made a Pro Bowl and an All-Pro team with Peyton Manning. Julius Thomas made 2 Pro Bowls with Peyton Manning. Ken Dilger made a Pro Bowl with Peyton Manning. Emmanuel Sanders made a Pro Bowl with Peyton Manning. So you look at it, Peyton had Harrison playing at a Pro Bowl level from 1999 to 2006. So that's 8 years of full Pro Bowl production with 3 All-Pro appearances in there. You had Wayne playing at that level from 06 to 2010. And then you had Demaryius Thomas from 2010 to from 2012 to 2014, along with Julius Thomas, who made a couple Pro Bowls in 13 and 14. You had a couple other guys, again, Ken Dilger, Emmanuel Sanders, Dallas Clark. Peyton certainly had a lot of receiving help. He had a great receiver duo in Indy, great tight end. Denver wasn't quite as stacked. Thomas was a very good player. Sanders was a very good player. I do think Julius Thomas got carried a little by Manning, but he was still a good player. So you do have to give you do have to give him some of the credit for that, and you would have to say, yes, that's very good help for Peyton. You compare that to Montana. Montana had 9 seasons from Pro Bowl receivers or tight ends. He had 6 All-Pro seasons from receivers or tight ends. Jerry Rice with Montana made it to 5 Pro Bowls and made it to 5 All-Pro teams from 1986 to 1990. Dwight Clark made it to 2 Pro Bowls and a first-team All-Pro team with Joe Montana from 81 to 82, so his first 2 seasons. And then John Taylor made it to 2 Pro Bowls in 1988 and 1989. Rice was the most dominant receiver that either of these guys had, but considering Montana only played with an elite Jerry Rice for 5 seasons where he was playing at an all-pro level, and Manning had Harrison for 8 years, you also look at the fact that outside of Rice, Montana had Clark was very good, Taylor was very good, but Manning had Wayne and Thomas and Clark and Julius Thomas and Ken Dilger and Emmanuel Sanders. That outweighs what Montana had. So Manning does get Montana does get the advantage in the receiving weapons for the receivers and the tight ends over Manning in terms of having less help throughout their careers. Moving on to the offensive line help, I did the same thing I did for the receivers and tight ends, which is I took the Pro Bowl seasons and the All-Pro seasons for each of Peyton's offensive linemen and Montana's offensive linemen, and I compared them. And this one was actually very close. It was very tough for me to decide who had the better offensive lines. Both of them had good offensive lines. They didn't have elite offensive lines, really. Montana did in 1984, and Manning had, a couple in 05, 06. But outside of that, the offensive lines were usually just pretty good rather than elite. Manning's offensive lines, he had 11 Pro Bowl offensive line seasons, which was Jeff Saturday, who made 5 Pro Bowls with Peyton Manning, Ron Clady, who made 2, Tarek Glenn, who made 3, and Luis Vasquez, who made 1. As for All-Pro seasons, Jeff Saturday made 2, Ron Clady made 1, and Luis Vasquez made 1. So Peyton Manning had 11 Pro Bowl offensive line seasons and 4 first-team All-Pro offensive lineman seasons. Compare that to Joe Montana. He had 9 Pro Bowl offensive line seasons, which was Randy Cross, who made 3 Pro Bowls. You had Fred Quillian, who made 2 Pro Bowls. You had Gus McIntyre, who made 2 Pro Bowls. You had John Alt, who made a Pro Bowl. And then Keith Fonhorst, who also made a Pro Bowl. All of those guys made Pro Bowls, which equates to 9 for Montana, which actually on a per-season average is slightly higher than Manning's. But where Manning's outweighs Montana is the All-Pros. Manning had 4 first-team All-Pro offensive line seasons. Montana, the only All-Pro offensive lineman he ever had was Keith Fonhorst in 1984, making first-team All-Pro at right tackle. He never had another first-team All-Pro offensive lineman. So for this category, I am going to give Manning a bit of a disadvantage here. So I do think Montana had worse offensive lines throughout their career, just slightly, but worse, which gives him the advantage in the offensive line support category. Next up, we see the defensive support category, and this is when the gap between Montana's help and Peyton's help begins to really start to grow. I took, as I did for offenses, yards per play and scoring defenses for each season of these guys' careers. So Peyton's defenses in yards per play and Montana's defenses in yards per play. Peyton's defenses in yards per play averaged a ranking of 16.4, so about 16.5, about league average. Montana's averaged ninth, so they averaged above average. They were a top 10 defense pretty much annually. Peyton had one number 1 ranked defense in yards per play, 4 top 5 defenses in yards per play, and 5 top 10 defenses in yards per play. Montana had no number 1 defenses in yards per play. He did have 5 top 5 defenses in yards per play and 8 top 10 defenses in yards per play. Keep in mind, guys, Montana played 5 fewer seasons than Manning did. 5 fewer seasons than Manning did. He had more top 10 defenses in yards per play than Manning did in 5 fewer seasons. He had more top 5 defenses in yards per play than Manning did in 5 fewer seasons. He never had a bottom 10 defense in yards per play. He never had one. Peyton had 6 bottom 10 defenses in yards per play. 1998, 2000, 2001, 2004, 2005, and 2006 were all bottom 10 defenses in yards per play. Montana's defenses in yards per play significantly outperformed Peyton Manning's. Then we get to the scoring defenses, where again, we see a gap. This is an even bigger gap here. Peyton Manning, his average scoring defense was 14.6, so 14.5, slightly above average. Montana, they averaged 6th. They averaged to be the 6th scoring defense in the NFL when Montana was the quarterback. That is a crazy, crazy statistic. That takes you into account that an average defense for Montana is the 6th best in the NFL in scoring. For Peyton, it's 14. 14. That's a huge gap. You look at the scoring defenses, Peyton and Montana each had one number 1 scoring defense. Peyton had 4 top 5 scoring defenses and 7 top 10 scoring defenses. Montana had 8 top 5 scoring defenses and 10 top 10 scoring defenses. Keep in mind, guys, Montana had more top 5 and top 10 scoring defenses in 5 fewer seasons than Peyton. Peyton had a bottom 10 defense in scoring 4 times. When you look at 1998, 2001, 2006, and 2010. Compared to Montana, the only year he had a bottom 10 scoring defense, 1982. As we can see, defensively, it's not even a competition. It is not a competition. Montana had much more defensive support over his career than Peyton Manning did, giving him the big loss in this category. Peyton Manning wins the category for having much less defensive support. The final category in the support category is the head coaches. And I think when it comes to head coaches, similarly to the defenses, there isn't really a debate here. There's not a huge debate. Peyton Manning had Jim Mora from 1998 to 2001, Tony Dungy from 2002 to 2008, Jim Caldwell from 2009 to 2010, John Fox from 2012 to 2014, and Gary Kubiak in 2015. Compare that to Montana, who had Bill Walsh from 1981 to 1988, George Seifert from 1989 to 1990, and Marty Schottenheimer from 1993 to 1994. There's not a competition here. I mean, Jim Mora was a decent coach. He was never an elite coach or anything like that. Tony Dungy is a Hall of Fame coach, so Peyton did have that. Caldwell was just an average coach. Fox was not a good coach. Kubiak was a whatever coach. Montana had Bill Walsh, who is, I think, non-debatably the greatest offensive mind in the history of the NFL. He is the greatest offensive innovator. His offense changed the NFL as it is today. It really kind of started and kickstarted the modern day passing game with the West Coast offense. And Walsh is a Hall of Famer. He's regarded as one of the best coaches ever. He was Montana's coach for 8 years. George Seifert probably will be a Hall of Fame coach. He won 2 Super Bowls, was very consistent with the Niners. And Marty Schottenheimer coached forever and had a lot of success. Montana's coaches, similar to his defenses, were all elite. Peyton had a couple good ones, a couple not good ones, kind of carried a couple of them. Montana certainly loses this category. Peyton had much less support when it came to head coaches. When it comes to intangibles, I think this one's very tough to call. You do have to say that Montana played in the better system offensively with Bill Walsh. Peyton did have a ton of offensive coordinators, whereas Montana stayed in the same West Coast system, which certainly helped him. And the West Coast system, it was still new around that time, whereas Peyton has had to deal with, offenses that have been the book has been out on the West Coast offense when Peyton was playing more than it was when Montana was playing. So Peyton's had to deal with more from defenses in that way. Obviously, defensively, you could hit a lot more in the 80s than you could in the aughts and especially the early 2010s. So that definitely goes in favor of Montana. Peyton had the longevity over Montana. He was more durable. Montana missed a lot of games because he did not take care of his body the way Peyton Manning or Tom Brady did. Outside of the neck surgery in 2011, which basically zapped Peyton of all his arm strength, Peyton didn't miss any games. He always played games. You look at, they both played in non-climate controlled environments. Montana played in outdoors, sunny San Francisco. Peyton played in a dome, and then he went to Denver and played in altitude. So that is a plus for Peyton in terms of playing in Denver. Montana did go to KC, but it was for a shorter period of time than Peyton was in Denver, and it was not as good. You look at the leadership. I think both of them were great leaders. They were both very tough players. Peyton was the smarter player, I think, just in terms of being able to check out a plays. Peyton really changed the quarterback position with his mind. He was, I think, in terms of being an encyclopedia of knowledge, the smartest quarterback of all time. Montana was a very smart quarterback in his own right. In terms of scrambling, I think Montana was probably a better scrambler than Peyton was. Both were capable, but neither of them were exactly Michael Vick or Lamar or someone like that. Just arm strength, pretty even. Neither of them had arms that really wowed you the way a Favre would, or a Mahomes or a Rodgers or that kind of arm would. You look at Peyton, I think, was a bit more willing to take downfield shots than Montana was, which can be a plus or a minus. Accuracy-wise, pretty much even there. So talent-wise, they were pretty even as players. I think Manning was the smarter player. I think Montana had a little bit better leadership. I think he was a bit more clutch than Manning was. Manning had to deal with tougher offensive systems. Montana had to deal with tougher defenses and more physical defenses. So I think I'd give the intangibles category a straight up tie. I don't think either one had greater intangibles than the other. Each have their own advantages and disadvantages compared to one another. I'll give that as a straight up tie. So after going through everything in the criteria and going through everything about each of these players, their careers, what they accomplished, their statistics, their team support, and their intangibles, my final verdict, based on the criteria, is Peyton Manning is greater than Joe Montana. And based on the criteria, I don't really think you can argue. Uh, when we look at it, Peyton Manning wins the regular season argument by a decent margin. When it comes to winning, his teams won at basically the same rate for a longer period of time than Joe Montana's teams did. Statistically, same thing. Peyton's volume statistics far outweigh Montana's in the regular season. Efficiency wise, it's pretty even, but when you also factor in the fourth quarter comebacks and game winning drives, Peyton clearly wins that. In the postseason, that's where Montana really makes this a compelling argument. That is the one category that he dominates Peyton in. Much better playoff quarterback, won a lot more won at a much higher rate, and had much better statistics in the playoffs, and specifically when you go to those Super Bowl stats. But Peyton was a more accomplished quarterback in terms of his accolades. He had more awards. He won more MVPs, made more All-Pro teams, made more Pro Bowls. He led the league in more statistical categories. He won. Just overall, he had more achievements than Montana did. When it comes to support, Peyton had less support than Joe Montana. Peyton had slightly better receiving talent and offensive line talent, but Montana had significantly better run games, significantly better defenses and coaches. Montana had much more support than Peyton Manning did. Now, I'm not saying Peyton Manning didn't have support because he clearly did, but Montana's support is probably the greatest we'll ever see based on the fact that he did not play in a salary cap era. Peyton Manning has. Peyton Manning's had to go through several different rosters, whereas Montana hasn't. And so that is certainly an argument that falls in favor of Peyton Manning. And then for the intangibles, it's too close to call for me. Montana was probably the better leader, and he was more mobile, but Peyton Manning was smarter. He had to deal with an era of defenses that knew more about the offenses that he was running. He played in more offensive systems. Montana played against the tougher, more physical defenses in a less statistics-driven era than Manning did. And for me, that evens out when it comes to the intangibles. So, guys, based on this is the only thing that you can really argue is the criteria. But based on this, Peyton Manning is greater than Montana. The only thing Montana wins over Peyton is the playoffs. And while the playoffs are certainly a big part of judging a quarterback and measuring how great a quarterback is, it is not everything. Peyton Manning was the better quarterback in the regular season. Peyton Manning was the more accomplished quarterback. Peyton Manning had less support than Joe Montana did. And when it comes to intangibles, it's pretty much it's a wash for me. So Peyton Manning is the greater quarterback than Joe Montana, according to me. Who do you guys think is greater all time, Joe Montana or Peyton Manning? I think this is going to be a very divisive topic. So I'd be very interested in hearing your opinions, and also suggest some other comparisons I should do, whether it's other all-time quarterbacks or other positions. I'm open to any of that kind of stuff. I'd be very interested in doing this in the future. Got a couple more that I'm interested in doing, but if you got any more, just make sure to let me know in the comments. And yeah, that is it for this video. God bless.